My name is Shawn, and welcome to Sagas with Shawn, Gods and Kings. Hi everyone, it's Shawn with another episode of Sagas with Shawn, Gods and Kings. Here with an episode that I convince myself is essential for my listeners to better understand what, in my opinion, is an item that may serve as a driving force behind the tragic endings for the Volsung family. Last week in our episode on the Merovingians, we discussed loose parallels to the Volsungs, where we covered their downfall primarily due to the feud/rivalry between Brynhild the Valkyrie and Princess Gudrun of the Niflungs. However, one other theme in that story is the role that fate plays in not just the saga of the Volsungs, but in the Norse sagas and myths in general. The characters in the story were aware of their fates and their tragic endings, but even sadder because of their inability to stop those endings. So what was driving this fate? In Norse mythology, there are three figures known as the Norns, Urd, Verdandi, and Skuld, who coerce the fates of not just men, but gods, leaving the Norse pantheon not all-powerful despite their status as deities. So if these Norns control the fates of gods and men, a case could be made that they are the most powerful beings in the Norse universe. Chapter 15 of Gylfaginning from Snorri Sturluson's Prose Edda says this about the Norns.
A handsome hall stands under the ash tree Yggdrasil, beside the well of Urd. Out of this hall comes three maidens, who are called Urd, Verdandi, and Skuld. These maidens shape men's lives. We call them the Norns. Yet there are more Norns, those who come to each person at birth to decide the length of one's life, and these are related to the gods. Others are descended from the elves, and a third group of Norns comes from the dwarfs.
Snorri mentions at this point that those on this world who have prosperous lives are guided by happy or prosperous Norns. Those with bad lives, let's just say less so, as we will see with the ring bearers of Andvaranaut. Then Snorri gives us a quote from the Poetic Edda poem Fafnir. And note that the speaker here is a certain figure that we mentioned last week, Fafnir the dragon. He says in stanza 13 of Fafnir,
born of very different parents, I believe the Norns are. They do not share kinship. Some are of the Aesir, some are of the elves, some are the daughters of Dvalin,
who would be the dwarves. Now in this episode, there will be many obvious parallels to Tolkien's work, as we have already seen. But the dwarves in this universe are also great craftsmen, as we will see with nearly all of the magical weapons, armor, and hair that the gods possess. The dwarves Eitri and Brock, for example, created many of the powerful artifacts owned by the gods, including, but not limited to, Thor's hammer Mjolnir. Now, the primary magical artifact that really will drive this connection to Tolkien's work home is a certain cursed, precious ring. In this episode, we will discuss that ring and the many ring bearers we can put together throughout the Norse myths and sagas, potentially linking to the historical realm in the timeline. The ring, called Andvaranaut, will serve to link the chains of time from gods to kings in this episode, starting with our friends Odin, Loki, and Honor, then through the Volsungs, the ancestor to the kingdoms of Norway, Denmark, and Sweden that exist today. This is significant because earlier, Dvalin is named as the, quote, father of Norns. It implies that fate itself may have been born from this dwarvish craft. As we know from my ELI 5 recap last week, the Volsungs, though a once strong family of kings, have a tragic ending that is torn apart via Brynhild and Gudrun, who both at different points are ring bearers. And this tragic ending seems to have been fated from the get-go. So if the Norns help shape the Volsungs' fate, then perhaps this ring Andvaranaut, forged by the dwarves and cursed by greed, was the instrument through which this fate was carried out. Now, moving on to the sources for this episode, I'll be using various poems from the Poetic Edda, Skadskaparmal from the Prose Edda, and the Saga of the Volsungs. Both Skadskaparmal and many of the poems of the second half of the Poetic Edda speak to this family and give similar but sometimes contradictory stories, as we will see. I will start with Skadskaparmal, which introduces the ring, specifically the story of Otter's Ransom, which introduces Andvaranaut and its first wielder, Andvari the dwarf. In this story, Odin, Honor, and Loki are traveling together in Svartalfheim, the realm of the dwarves, and come to a river and eventually a waterfall named Andvari Falls, where they see an otter who had caught a salmon. Loki decides impulsively to throw a stone at it, killing the otter who had already caught the salmon. Loki brags about his catch, knowing that they will feast well that night. The gods took both the otter and the salmon, continued their travels, and came to a house owned by a farmer named Tridmar. The text states that he was a powerful man, skilled in magic, and yes, he and his family were dwarves as well. The three gods asked to stay at the farmer's house that night, showing Hreidmar their catch they could feast on as a gift in the hopes that the farmer would let them stay the night. However, Hreidmar, upon seeing their quote, catch, immediately is filled with rage as the otter was his son, who happened to also be named Otter and happened to have been in the shape of an otter. Hreidmar calls on his other sons, a duo that we have mentioned previously named Regin and Fafnir, to help him seize the three gods. Now captured, the Aesir, upon realizing Loki's fuck-up, decide to offer Hreidmar gold as blood money for his son's death. Hreidmar agrees to this arrangement. I mean, his son was in the form of an otter, after all, so there may have been some understanding on his part. Hreidmar may be understanding but seeing a chance here to get rich, demands enough gold to fill the inside of his now dead son Otter's skin, who at this point was flayed, and also cover the outside of his skin with the gold as well. Odin makes Loki go get the gold since this was his screw up. Now, Loki, obviously being the warm, lovable, hardworking character that he is, decides to pull himself up by his bootstraps, work minimum wage, and raise the gold himself over the span of 25 years, not spending $5 on lattes from Starbucks because billionaires on social media told him that that was the way to generate wealth. I'm kidding, he went and stole it from another dwarf. This dwarf's name was Andvari, and he was quite wealthy and was disguised at that time as a fish in water. These dwarves seem to love to take the shape of animals. Loki, fresh with the bloodlust of his previous experience with a dwarf disguised as an animal, captures the fish and demands his treasure that currently lay in Andvari's, quote, home of stone. The text says,
Then they entered into the rock, and the dwarf brought forward all of his gold. It was a huge treasure, but the dwarf hid in his hand a little gold ring. Loki saw him do this and told him to hand it over. The dwarf begged Loki to not take the ring, claiming it was his precious. He confided that if the ring remained in his possession, he would be able to make more wealth for himself.
The quote from Gollum, I of course added myself, but unlike Boromir, Loki successfully takes the ring along with the gold, and then Andvari warns him that the ring would be the death of whoever possessed it. So Andvari, obviously pissed off that this god stole everything, seems to have cursed this special ring, prophesizing misfortune and death on its future bearers. Loki didn't care, but he did say that he would relay the message. He left Andvari penniless, so this cursed ring, first belonging to Andvari, now has a new ring bearer, Loki. Also note that having a ring that generates gold would be somewhat of a temptation for many people. However, as we don't see the ring do that moving forward, maybe Andvari's curse removed this trait, or others simply did not know how to wield it in this manner as Andvari did. So Loki returns to Hreidmar's place and shows Odin the gold that they were going to pay Hremdar with. However, in that pile of gold, Odin notices the ring. He removes it from the treasure. So at this point, the new bearer, albeit briefly, is the Allfather himself. They stuff the otter's skin with gold on the inside and cover the outside as well. However, a whisker of the otter still remained exposed. Odin then decides to put the ring on the whisker, covering it. It must have been a very small whisker if it is covered entirely by a ring, but also very sturdy, I guess, to hold the ring. The gods, having paid their blood debt to the father of Otter, pack up to leave, but not before Loki relayed Andvari's warning. The new ring bearer is now the farmer, Hreidmar. Unfortunately for him, the curse holds true at this point. Hreidmar's two remaining sons, Fafnir and Regin, ask their father for some of his new wealth. However, he declines, and the brothers kill their father in response. Regin suggests at that point dividing the gold evenly with his brother. However, Fafnir declined this as well and took the money for himself, and told his brother to leave else he would kill him. Not only is Fafnir now the new ring bearer of the ring Andvaranaut, but he also took his father's helmet and sword, left for a place called Nidaheath, where he made a lair for himself and took the form of a dragon. So at this point, we have a dragon hoarding gold with a magical ring present, not unlike Smaug and the One Ring from the Hobbit, if that was not obvious. Regin fled to the court of King Hjalprik in Denmark, becoming his royal smith. There, he comes across a certain landless king named Sigurd from the house of Volsung, and a direct descendant of Odin, funny enough. Regin becomes his foster father. So let's stop there for a second. We have Andvari, Loki, Odin, Hreidmar, and now Fafnir the dragon as ring bearers of Andvaranaut. But more importantly, we also have what seems to be the prequel story of the Volsungs. Now, moving on to the Poetic Edda poem Regensmal, which takes place after Regin becomes Sigurd foster father in Denmark, and Regin himself gives his recounting of the events that we just discussed from Skadskaparmal. The story remains for the most part the same, but has some additional details. The prose introduction adds in that Loki, in order to catch Andvari in the first place, needed to go to the goddess Ran to get her fishing net, which is what he used to catch the dwarf. So this Ran is the wife of the god Aegir. Aegir is the god who hosted the party of the gods, which went sour, drunkenly insulted all of the gods. For an earlier portion of Skadskaparmal, it says this of Ran.
Ran was the name of Aegea's wife, and they had 9 daughters. And at this feast, everything, the food, the ale, and all the necessary tableware, served itself, kind of like the characters in Beauty and the Beast. The Aesir became aware that Ran had a net, and with it she caught all the men who came into the sea.
So anyway, please do not get lost at sea because Ran, the sea goddess, will catch you with her net. Now back to Regensmal, you find out that Andvari was the son of Oin, and states that a cruel Norn shaped his fate and cursed him to live in the water. So he seems to have been a pikefish, not by choice. And as we mentioned, those with bad lives have these negative fates being shaped by Norns who also have seemed to have bad lives. So it seems that Andvari was a victim of this. So Oin is mentioned as being the father of Andvari in this poem. Now going to the poem Voluspa, when they list the names of the dwarfs near the beginning of the poem, Oin is included in some translations, but in some he is not. Not too important, but something that I did notice in researching information for this episode. Now, going back to Regensmal, in stanza 5, we hear more about Andvari's curse of the ring right from his mouth. And he says,
The goad in the gust used to own will cause the death of 2 brothers, and cause grief for 8 kings. No one will enjoy my treasure if I can't.
So you also find out in the poem that the 3 brothers, Adar, Regin, and Fafnir, had 2 sisters, Lingheither and Lafenheath. Something else interesting here is that Regin, again telling the story to Sigurd, does not mention that he took part in his father's slaying, but that it was all Fafnir. Regin was telling Sigurd this story to convince him to kill his brother Fafnir the dragon. So in trying to drum up sympathy for him, he obviously would not want to discuss his role in the kinslaying driven by greed, which was probably influenced by Andvaranaut. Now, as far as the death of the 2 brothers mentioned by Andvari in this curse, since Otter was already dead, we can only imagine at this point the 2 brothers Andvari is mentioning is Fafnir and Regin, as we will see. As far as the 8 kings who will experience grief, that will be a tad more difficult, but still pretty easy since everybody in this saga experiences some grief. So I'm confident that I can put the pieces together by the end of this episode. So from this point, we have the primary story of the Saga of the Volsungs with Sigurd set up. Per the saga, Sigurd is convinced to go to Nidaheath and kill Fafnir the dragon by Regin. Sigurd's mother Hjordis gives him the broken sword of his father, King Sigmund, that was initially bestowed to him by Odin himself. So Regin reforges the broken blade of kings that Isildur, son of Elendil, used to cut the ring of Sauron, and it was renamed Anduril. I'm kidding, it was Gram. The sword in the story is called Gram, though Tolkien probably did take inspiration from Gram when writing about Aragorn's sword in Lord of the Rings. In slaying the dragon, Sigurd went to Nidaheath, hides in a hole that he dug, waits for Fafnir to slither over it, stabs upward when he does, dealing Fafnir his mortal blow. Fafnir lives a bit while dying and has a conversation. Fafnir asks Sigurd who his killer was. Sigurd was initially hesitant to answer, and the text states that the reason why is that the words of those approaching the veil of death have power in this world. However, that hesitation lasted all the way from stanza 2 to stanza 4, where Sigurd gives up his name. Then in stanza 9, Fafnir says something.
You think everything I say to you is mockery, but I tell you the truth. My cleaning goad, this wealth that glows like embers, will bring about your death.
I don't know why I thought the hissing would be enough for me to sound like a dragon. Sigurd then asks Fafnir about the Norns, which results in the stanza 13 quote from earlier that Snorri himself quoted in Skadskaparmal. And he states that some Norns are related to gods, some elves, and then some to dwarves. They continue their conversation, and as he was dying, Fafnir's warning somewhat turns into genuine advice, urging Sigurd to go home and leave the gold, advice that Sigurd declines. He then warns Sigurd about his brother Regin's true intentions, saying that Regin would betray him. Fafnir the dragon dies, and then with convenient timing, Regin shows up to acknowledge Sigurd's victory. Sigurd, however, states that the only reason that he killed Fafnir was not for the love and empathy for Regin, his foster father, but because he took Regin's request as a challenge for himself. Regin encourages Sigurd to cook and eat Fafnir's heart, which he agrees to. Sigurd touches the meat to test it, since they did not have meat thermometers back then, and he put his finger up to his tongue to taste. And suddenly he can then understand the language of birds. He hears birds overhead commenting on how Regin is totally going to betray Sigurd, just as Fafnir said. Sigurd then cuts off Regin's head, and the sons of Hreidmar are now all dead. And two brothers, since Andvari's warning, have suffered their death. The birds then tell Sigurd to go find a certain princess and daughter of King Budli, Brynhild the Valkyrie. He does this, but not before taking Fafnir's treasure, and obviously the ring Andvaranaut as well, becoming its next bearer. The ring itself here specifically was not mentioned in the saga or in Fafnismal, however, though funny enough, in the saga, on top of the gold and some named weapons and armor that Sigurd takes, it does say that there are, quote, many other precious treasures. So why did Sigurd, who clearly believed the dying dragon's warning, especially with Regin's inevitable betrayal, still take the gold? Now this is where fate comes into play again. Sigurd knew his fate, which might explain why he questions Fafnir about the Norns. Sigurd knows his fate because in the poem Gripspa, Sigurd visits his maternal uncle, King Gripir, to ask about his future. Remember, Sigurd is not just royal on his father's side. His mother, Princess Hjordis, was the daughter of King Elemi, and Gripir, being the son of Elemi, is now the king and is Sigurd's uncle. So Gripir tells him everything, that he'll slay a dragon, kill both Regin and Fafnir, gain immense treasure and fame, and meet a beautiful enchanted princess, Brynhild. But when Sigurd presses for more, Gripir hesitates, finally revealing that Brynhild will be the source of his downfall, and that death awaits him soon after. Regarding the warning about Brynhild, the text in stanza 29 of Gripspa says,
"She will make you sleepless. She will make you senseless. You'll pay attention to nothing unless you are with that girl."
Gripspa ends with Gripir predicting Sigurd's death at Brynhild's command, but he softens the blow, saying that no greater man will ever walk the earth. So Sigurd knows all of this, the heartbreak, the betrayal, the curse, and still goes through with it. He takes Fafnir's gold and basically decides, yeah, well, I guess fate's going to kill me anyway. Might as well live while I can. And honestly, I do kind of respect it. While Brynhild and Gudrun eventually drown in existential grief, Sigurd accepts the script and plays his part with style. Could he have said, no, I'm not going to bring this cursed ring into my family? Probably not, because as always, the Norns have already made their decision, starting with the one who set Andvari's curse in motion in the first place. Now, the full details in the Volsungs, including the multiple meetings between Sigurd and Brynhild, some of which are contradictory, are probably better for another episode. Here, I'll do my best to primarily focus on Sigurd's treasure and the ring Andvaranaut, though I'll probably need to cover some portions I mentioned last week as well, or have yet to cover on this podcast. So chapter 24 of the Saga of the Volsungs, and this is going to be Crawford's version, is titled, quote, Sigurd meets Brynhild, which is confusing because he already met her in chapter 21, hence the contradictions. In that earlier chapter, 21, Sigurd finds Brynhild in armor, asleep. He awakens her, and she recounts her falling out with Odin, offering wisdom to Sigurd reminiscent of Havamal. In my other podcast, Between Two Ravens, my co-host David and I did a more detailed episode on this, and we concluded that the first meeting in chapter 21 could have potentially been a dream or a vision that they both may have had separately. And yes, that is a huge leap by us, and we were trying to explain away the first two meetings to make it work. Now, in their second first meeting in chapter 24, Sigurd travels to a hall where Brynhild was and states his intention to give her gold and to marry her, as the birds encouraged him to do. Brynhild told Sigurd that she was essentially bad news and that he should not want to marry her. Remember, she also knew of his fate and her fate and that it would be bad news. She knew that she would eventually have him killed. By the end of the chapter, however, he conveyed his love for her, and she, going against her initial impulses, returned the sentiment and they became engaged. Events in a later chapter confirmed that this is where they had sex and conceived Aslog. The chapter ends by saying,
Sigurd thanked her for this and gave her a golden ring, and they swore these oaths again, and he went away.
So the new ring bearer of Andvaranaut is Brynhild, the Valkyrie, princess and daughter of King Budli. And Andvaranaut seems to have been her engagement ring. A cursed ring as an engagement ring, of course, means absolutely nothing with the marriage could go wrong. So by chapter 27, Sigurd had lost his memories at the hands of Gudrun's mother, Grimhild, and he marries Gudrun instead. And then he helps his new brother-in-law, Gunnar, to marry Brunhild. Disguised as Gunnar, he rides through Brynhild's ring of fire on his horse Granny. After this, still as Gunnar, he shares a bed with Brynhild. He placed his sword Gram in between them, signaling that he would not sleep with her, and also signaling restraints and not betraying his now brother-in-law by sleeping with his bride-to-be, and replaces Andvaranaut at this point with another ring from Fafnir's treasure while she slept. So he takes the ring back. Quick side note, Sigurd's horse Granny is actually descended from Odin's horse Sleipnir, who is a son of Loki, and this creates a fun parallel of Odin and his horse, Sleipnir, a son of Loki, and then Sigurd, a descendant of Odin, and his horse, Granny, a descendant of Loki. In the next chapter, 28, Gudrun and Brynhild have a conversation in the Rhine River regarding the location of the Rhine. Though the river actually does flow northward, from north to south, it would stretch from the North Sea around modern-day Netherlands through modern-day Germany, then the lands bordering Germany and France. It continues until it starts to circle modern-day Switzerland, and I'm pretty sure ends up around the very small country of Liechtenstein. Seeing as how the Volsungs are in Francia, lands for which most part would later become what we know of as France, this would make sense. Anyway, Brynhild, still tormented by her love for Sigurd, boasts to his wife Gudrun that her husband Gunnar is the greater man for riding through the Ring of Fire, only for Gudrun to reveal that it was actually Sigurd who rode through the Ring of Fire and shows her the cursed ring Andvaranaut as proof. Realizing the truth that she did not marry the man who rode through the Ring of Fire, even more so that it should have been the man that she loved, she is obviously upset. Brynhild's despair drives her to have Sigurd slain before taking her own life. Their fates united at last in death in Hell, the underworld. Now, Snorri in Skadskaparmal gives a slightly different version of this. He states that in this meeting, while disguised as Gunnar, everything is the same, but the ring Andvaranaut is given to Brynhild here instead of taken from her, indicating a contradiction of when she was given Andvaranaut as an engagement ring. So Brynhild would have been the first time ring bearer now and not have ceased to be its bearer. I'm going to go with the version where Sigurd takes the ring back and then gives it to Gudrun, allowing her to gloat to Brynhild about having it while they were in the river. So Gudrun would have been the new ring bearer, and she, a new widow and still in possession of the cursed ring, is forced at the urging of her scheming mother Grimhild to marry Brynhild's brother, King Atli. In his greed, Atli desires Sigurd's treasure, probably why he wanted to marry Gudrun in the first place. When he invites her brothers, Gunnar and Hogni, to his hall under the guise of friendship, Gudrun, knowing his true plans, secretly warns them in advance by sending a ring bound with a wolf's hair. Now, the text here does not state that the ring is Andvaranaut. However, the Poetic Edda short, called Drop Niflunga, it does. So this ring is indeed Andvaranaut. So Atli's messenger, Vingi, travels to the brothers to deliver their invitations. Vingi is the new ring bearer of Andvaranaut, but he alters the runes that contains Gudrun's message, twisting her warning into an encouragement to come. Though suspicious, the brothers decide to go to King Atli despite the pleas of their wives, Glomvor and Kostbera, implying Gunnar remarried, obviously after Brynhild killed herself. Quick note that at this point, Gunnar/Hogni, still in their kingdom in Burgundy, are bearing the ring Andvaranaut. Now, ignoring the warnings, Gunnar and Hogni ride out to Atli's kingdom, not to treat with him, but for war, and a brutal battle follows at Atli's keep, where even Gudrun joins the fighting. Vingi is slain, and the brothers fight fiercely before being captured. So the ring's path seems to pass from Gudrun to Vingi, the messenger, then to Gunnar, and perhaps briefly Hogni, Kostbera, or Glomvor, as they all deciphered it in an attempt to decipher Gudrun's message. When Atli demands the secret location of Sigurd's gold, the brothers refuse. Atli then cuts out Hogni's heart and shows it to Gunnar. But still, he will not speak, declaring,
"Now I am the only one who knows where the gold is, and Hogni can no longer tell you. I was always in doubt while the two of us lived, but now I am certain the secret is safe with me alone." Let the Rhine River have the treasure, and let the Huns never know where it lies.
Boom. So before going to Atli's kingdom, the brothers put the treasure with the ring into the Rhine River. At this point, Gunnar is killed in a snake pit, and the known location in the Rhine River of Andvaranaut is lost. But at this point, Gudrun, in her rage, killed her kids with Atli, fed their blood to him, and then she killed Atli as well. She unsuccessfully tries to commit suicide, eventually marries a King Yannikr after arriving at his court with her and Sigurd's daughter Svanhild. Svanhild is eventually killed on the orders of another king, Jormunrek, and her sons with Yannikr are killed as well, ending the saga. Also, earlier, her son with Sigurd, Sigmund, who would have been Sigmund II if he was king, was killed with his father. Now, the poem Atlach Thida in the Poetic Edda seems to say that Gudrun died after she killed her sons in Atli. So, in that case, the third marriage with Yannikr would not have happened. However, I'll go with a version where she fails to commit suicide after this, as she was not fated to die, to keep the theme of fate in this episode. Though, since Gudrun did bear the ring, maybe that would be canon per Andvari's warning that the wielders will all die. But I also don't want to throw out the end of the Saga of the Volsungs and Gudrun's third marriage, including Svanhild's death, which I also think is necessary to show that only Aslog is the one true heir of the Volsungs. So to sum it up, the bearers of the ring Andvaranaut are Andvari, Loki, briefly, Odin, even more briefly, Freidmar, Fafnir, Sigurd, Brynhild, Gudrun, Vingi, Gunnar/Hogni, then the cursed ring is swallowed in the mouth of the Rhine. I found this interesting because in the book The Fellowship of the Ring, written by Tolkien, who looked at Andvaranaut in this episode as inspiration for his one true ring, in its chapter on the Council of Elrond, as influential men, dwarves, elves, Gandalf, and hobbits were figuring out what to do with the One Ring of Sauron, one idea is floated is to simply drop it into the sea, so the ring wraiths and Sauron couldn't find it. Gandalf rejected the idea, stating that at some point it would just be delaying the inevitable, and that land changes over eons and Sauron would still be there in some form over the ages to pick it up. So maybe if the ring is in the Rhine River, it does live on. And one day the Norns, in their declaration of fate, know that it will be picked up. Now, as the Rhine seems to be less than 100 feet deep, maybe it won't take eons for the land to change, but it can be found now. Now, I did conduct a very basic Google search to see if any treasure has been found in the Rhine River, where people may have stated that it would come from the Dark Ages during the late Roman era or the centuries following it. And apparently, in 2014, an archaeologist discovered gold and silver dating back to the 5th century and speculated on it being Fafnir's treasure. I was more upset than I should have been when no ring was mentioned in the articles I reviewed, but it was stated that the archaeologist was being questioned at the time and may have taken some of the treasure himself, which would be just great if, just like Smeagol/Gollum and Loki, he saw the ring and immediately wanted it and put it into his pocket. Notes that this archaeologist apparently found it in a nearby forest, not in the Rhine itself. However, the treasure would have been around at the time of the Burgundians or Niflungs. Again, the family of Gudrun, Gunnar, Hogni, Guttorm, Grimhild, and Giuki. Now, before I close, I did want to state that Tolkien also drew from a more recent source that also drew inspiration from this story by Richard Wagner, who wrote a 19th century play called Das Rheingold, which pulled from the Norse stories and somewhat serves as bridging the initial 13th century sources with Tolkien. The story arc with the ring is similar and it ends up in the Rhine as well. I have not read or seen this play, but it would be wrong of me to not note this additional inspiration of Tolkien. So, to bring this all together, the story of the Volsungs, their tragic love triangle, and the cursed ring Andvaranaut is ultimately a story that is shaped by fate, by the Norns, who decide the threads of life for both gods and mortals. In this case, the fate of a dwarf named Andvari, who had a curse that would continue across generations. From Andvari, who was left penniless, the ring passes briefly through Loki and Odin, gods who have their own cursed fates at Ragnarok, to Freidmar, killed by his son, Fafnir the dragon, who was killed by Sigurd, Sigurd, killed on the orders of his lover, Brynhild, burned herself to death after losing her lover, Gudrun, who, funny enough, lives or dies depending on the source, but in the one where she lives, she has 2 husbands, 3 brothers, and 7 children dead. The messenger Vingi was beaten to death by Gunnar and Hogni, and then Gunnar and Hogni were tortured to death, but not before sinking the ring and the treasure to the bottom of the Rhine River. Each bearer becomes part of the unfolding of this curse. From greed to betrayal, lust to revenge, an endless chain in which the ring is both the instrument and symbol of this destiny. Now, going to the 8 kings that would experience grief that Andvari mentioned in his curse, here would be my list. You have King Atli, you have King Gunnar, then you have King Gripir. King Budli, who is the father of Atli and Brynhild, likely witnessed his daughter's torment and despair. King Giuki observed his wife Grimhild's manipulations in the deaths within his family. King Sigurd, obviously, he was a landless king of the Volsung lineage, but he was also a bearer of the ring, and he was killed through betrayal despite knowing his fate. You then could argue that Sigmund, his son, was the successor here to the Volsung line. He was killed in the ongoing cycle of vengeance, and again, you could argue that he was the rightful king after his father died, albeit briefly. Then you have King Yannikr, Gudrun's third husband, and he lost all 3 of their sons through vengeance and political scheming. Also, potentially, you could look at Hogni, who, if at that time the Niflungs split up their kingdoms after their deaths, that would not be too much of a stretch, as last week we saw that this was historical at this time in Francia, so he could have been a king as well. So let's tie all of this back to one of the bearers of the Cursed Ring, again, albeit briefly, Odin. As we discussed, Odin knew his fate to die at Ragnarok, and that he could not stop it. Yet he knew that the world would live on without him. And he remained true to the title Allfather, seeding the world with legendary and eventually historical kings and kingdoms. For the brief moment that Odin held Andvaranaut, taking it from Loki and giving it to Hreidmar, Regin was present, suggesting that this could have occurred during King Sigmund's life. Since Regin was the foster father of Sigurd, it could be argued that he was near the same age as Sigurd's real father, Sigmund. Now, perhaps in that brief moment when he held it, sensing the ring's power or curse, Odin reconsidered his earlier favor of Sigmund's, in which he gave him the sword Gram, ultimately changing his mind, deciding to kill Sigmund and set fate in motion. In doing so, he may have foreseen that the ring eventually reached his great-great-great-grandson Sigurd, since when Sigmund died, his then pregnant wife Hjordis fled to Denmark, where Sigurd was born and eventually was fostered by Regin, who guided Sigurd through his childhood, and as mentioned, reforged the sword Gram for him. So it is kind of fascinating to think, did Odin, in orchestrating Sigmund's death, also set the stage for Sigurd's rise, his tragic fate, and the eventual survival of his line through Aslog, who was Sigurd's daughter and the maternal ancestor to historical kings? In this way, even a cursed ring becomes part of a carefully guided legacy, all potentially at the hands of these Norns who can either have positive or sinister intentions with the souls that they guide. This echoes the idea that even powerful figures like gods or legendary kings are not free from the designs of fate. And it's precisely that sense of inexorable destiny that inspired Tolkien in creating his One Ring. In the Council of Elrond, Gandalf warns that simply casting the ring into the sea is only a temporary solution. But fate, not unlike Jeff Goldblum says with life, will find a way, just as it did with Andvaranaut, or with Frodo destroying the ring once and for all. So as far as history and legend are concerned, the Cursed Ring links gods to legendary kings to semi-historical rulers, showing how myth, saga, and the traces of historical imagination can merge. If it existed, it may still lie somewhere in the Rhine River, waiting, as the Norns already know, for its next chapter in history. Last note, since the Rhine is a part of the Earth, and the Earth itself is Thor's mother, as we know from the Eddas, and also Earth is the goddess personification of our planet, she could be said to be the current wielder of this cursed ring. And boy, is there a case to be made that this curse on the world is still very much active. So on that positive note, I appreciate you all. Have an amazing day. Thank you for listening to Sagas with Shawn, Gods and Kings. If you enjoyed the show, please follow me on Instagram, TikTok, or YouTube, and leave a 5-star review wherever you listen to your podcasts. Thank you, and have a great day.